original story narrated exclusively for love written in silence. Julian Ashford stands at the tall window of his ancestral library, his hand pressed flat against the cold glass, as rain streaks down in silver ribbons. His lips are sealed, not by injury or illness, but by a vow he made before God and the law 2 years ago. Behind him, the fire crackles in the stone hearth, and the servants move through the corridors, like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets and heavier silence. Then she arrives, Miss Catherine Hale, niece of the magistrate who once questioned him under oath, steps into Ashford Hall with a worn leather satchel and eyes that do not flinch from his stillness. She does not ask him to speak. She does not plead or coax. Instead, she sits across from him that first evening and begins to tell him a story, one that mirrors his own pride, his own fear, his own refusal to let go of what no longer serves him. Ashford Hall had not always been silent. Once its great rooms had echoed with laughter and argument, with the clatter of boots on marble, and the hum of voices raised in debate or celebration. But for 2 years now, the house had held its breath. Servants moved through the corridors with downcast eyes and careful hands. Doors were opened and closed without sound. Meals were served in a hush broken only by the clink of silver on porcelain. And at the center of it all sat Duke Julian Ashford, a man of 35 years, broad-shouldered and upright, who had not spoken a single word since the spring of 1852. The reason was known to all who lived within the estate's stone walls, though few understood it. During a legal inquest involving disputed land and tenant grievances, Julian had been called to testify. His word, as duke and landowner, would have carried the weight of law. His voice could have swayed the magistrate, influenced the outcome, tipped the scales in his favor, regardless of truth. And so, rather than risk that power, he had chosen silence. He had submitted his testimony in writing, every line carefully composed, every argument stripped of the authority his title might lend it. He had sat in that courtroom for 3 days without uttering a sound, his pen the only instrument of his will. The magistrate had ruled. The tenants had been heard. Justice, as far as Julian could measure it, had been served. But the silence had not ended. It had become something else, a discipline, a penance, a proof of his own moral rigor. He had not spoken since, not even in the privacy of his own chambers, not even to his aunt, the Dowager Duchess Constance, who had raised him after his parents' death, and who now managed the social obligations he could no longer fulfill. The household had adapted. His steward, Mr. Pembroke, read Julian's written instructions aloud at morning meetings. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, interpreted his gestures with the ease of long practice. His aunt received callers on his behalf, offering gracious apologies and vague explanations about a temporary indisposition. The estate ran smoothly. The tenants were cared for. The accounts were kept, and Julian Ashford remained locked within the fortress of his own making. A man who had chosen principle over presence and found himself unable to remember how to return. The great library, where he spent most of his evenings, was a room of shadows and firelight. Shelves rose from floor to ceiling, lined with leather-bound volumes in Latin, Greek, English, and French. A globe stood in one corner, its painted oceans faded by time. Heavy curtains framed windows that looked out over the gardens, now bare in the grip of late winter. Julian sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, a book open on his lap, though he rarely turned the pages. He listened instead to the crackle of the fire, the whisper of wind against glass, the distant ticking of the clock in the hall. He had grown accustomed to the weight of silence. It no longer felt like absence. It felt like armor. But even armor can become a cage. The Dowager Duchess Constance was a woman of sharp intelligence and sharper instincts. She had watched her nephew retreat into silence with a mixture of pride and concern. She admired his moral conviction. She understood his reasons. But she also saw what he did not, that his silence had ceased to be a sacrifice and had become a refuge. He no longer spoke because he no longer wished to risk the world beyond his own thoughts. And so, when the opportunity arose, she acted. Miss Catherine Hale arrived at Ashford Hall on a cold afternoon in early March. She came by coach, alone save for a maid who returned to the village the same day. She carried a single trunk and a leather satchel worn smooth by years of use. She was 31 years old, unmarried, and the niece of Magistrate Edward Hale, the man who had presided over the inquest that had silenced Julian Ashford. Her uncle had died the previous autumn, leaving her a small inheritance and a collection of journals that chronicled his decades on the bench. Among those journals were notes about the Duke of Ashford, a man who had chosen muteness over influence and left the magistrate both impressed and troubled. Catherine had read those notes. She had thought about them, and when the Dowager Duchess extended an invitation for her to stay at Ashford Hall as a guest, ostensibly to catalogue a collection of legal texts in the library, she had accepted, not out of pity, not out of duty, but out of curiosity. She was a woman of medium height, slender and upright, with dark hair pinned simply at the nape of her neck. Her face was not beautiful in the fashionable sense, but it was striking. High cheekbones, a firm mouth, and eyes of clear gray that seemed to see through pretense. She dressed plainly, in dark wool and linen, and she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned early that her worth lay not in her appearance, but in her mind. The Dowager Duchess received her in the drawing room, a space of pale blue walls and gilded mirrors. Tea was served, pleasantries were exchanged, and then, with the directness that had made her both feared and admired in society, the Dowager came to the point. "My nephew does not speak, Miss Hale. You are aware of this. I am, Your Grace. He has not spoken in 2 years. He will not speak to you. He will not respond to questions or conversation. But he is not deaf, and he is not indifferent. He listens, he observes, and I believe he is lonely, though he would never admit it." Catherine set down her teacup with care. "What is it you wish me to do?" "Read to him, in the evenings, after dinner. He spends his nights in the library." I thought perhaps, if someone were to read aloud, it might offer him companionship without expectation. "You wish me to entertain him. I wish you to speak in his presence, without demanding that he answer." Catherine considered this. She did not look away from the Dowager's steady gaze. "And if I choose not to read, but to speak in some other way?" The Dowager smiled faintly. "Then I trust your judgment, Miss Hale. You are your uncle's niece. You understand the weight of words." That evening, after a quiet dinner, during which Julian sat at the head of the table and communicated only through nods, and the occasional written note passed to his aunt, Catherine made her way to the library. She had been shown the room earlier by Mrs. Dalton, who had pointed out the legal texts she was meant to catalogue. But Catherine had also noticed the chair by the fire, the small table beside it, the way the room seemed arranged for solitude. She entered without knocking. The door was open. Julian sat in his chair, a book in his hands, his profile lit by the glow of the hearth. He did not look up when she entered, but his stillness changed. It became attentive. Catherine did not ask permission. She crossed the room and took the chair opposite his, setting her satchel on the floor beside her. She did not open a book. She did not pull out a volume of poetry or a novel. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and began to speak. "I will not read to you, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I will tell you a story instead, one of my own making. You may listen or not, as you choose, but I will not ask you to respond." Julian's gaze lifted. His eyes, dark and unreadable, met hers. He did not nod. He did not gesture, but he did not look away. Catherine began. "There was once a magistrate," she said, her voice low and steady, "who believed that justice could only be pure if it was rendered in silence. He refused to speak his verdicts aloud, believing that the sound of his voice, its tone, its cadence, its authority, might sway the hearts of those who heard him in ways that words on paper could not. And so he wrote his judgments carefully, each one a model of reason and restraint. He believed he was serving the law. He believed he was protecting the accused from the weight of his own power." She paused, letting the fire fill the silence. "But one day," she continued, "a man was brought before him. A man accused of theft, a crime he had not committed. The evidence was thin. The magistrate saw this. He wrote his verdict with care. Not guilty. The man was freed. But as he left the courtroom, he wept, not with relief, with bitterness, because he had never heard the words spoken. He had never heard the magistrate say, 'You are innocent.' He had only seen ink on paper, and ink, no matter how just, cannot offer mercy. Only a voice can do that." Catherine stopped. She did not look at Julian to gauge his reaction. She simply rose, smoothed her skirts, and bid him good night. "Sleep well, Your Grace," she said, and left the room. Julian sat alone in the firelight for a long time after she had gone. The book in his lap remained unread. The story she had told echoed in the silence like a stone, dropped into still water. He did not know, yet, that it was the first of many. The days at Ashford Hall followed a rhythm as old as the house itself. Julian rose at dawn and walked the estate, his boots crunching over frost-hardened ground, his breath misting in the cold air. He inspected the stables, the tenant cottages, the fields that lay fallow until spring. He wrote notes to his steward, instructions for repairs and provisions, and left them on Pembroke's desk before breakfast. He attended to correspondence in the study, his pen moving steadily across thick paper. He took his meals in silence, his aunt presiding over the table with grace and occasional commentary on village affairs or distant relatives. And in the evenings, after the lamps were lit and the house settled into stillness, he went to the library. And Catherine was always there. She did not wait for him. She did not arrange herself for his arrival. She simply came to the library each night, took the chair opposite his, and began to speak. She told him stories, not fairy tales, not romances, but parables, fables, invented histories that felt true in the way that all good stories do. Each one was carefully crafted, each one a mirror held up to some aspect of his silence. On the second night, she told him of a king who believed that words were weapons, too dangerous to be wielded carelessly. He decreed that all matters of state would be conducted in writing. His counselors wrote petitions. His generals wrote battle plans. His people wrote their grievances on parchment and left them at the palace gates. For a time, the kingdom was orderly, but slowly, misunderstandings grew. Without tone or inflection, without the chance to ask and answer in the moment, meaning was lost, resentments festered. And when war finally came, it was not because of cruelty or greed, but because no one had spoken plainly enough to prevent it. On the third night, she spoke of a priest who refused to grant absolution aloud, believing that forgiveness was too sacred to be spoken. He wrote blessings on slips of paper and handed them to penitents in silence. But the people who came to him left feeling hollow. They had confessed their sins. They had been given paper, but they had not heard the words, "You are forgiven," and without hearing it, they could not believe it. On the fourth night, she told him of a woman who had learned to be silent because every time she spoke, she was told she was too loud, too sharp, too much. She learned to communicate through letters, through gestures, through careful smiles. She became invisible. And one day, when she needed to cry out, when she needed to be heard, she found that her voice had atrophied. She had forgotten how to use it. And no one came to help her, because no one knew she was in danger. Catherine never explained her stories. She never drew the connection, explicitly. She simply told them, her voice calm and clear. And then she left. Julian never responded, but he listened. And his stillness, night by night, became less like stone and more like water, still on the surface, but moving underneath. During the day, they crossed paths in small, unplanned moments. Catherine catalogued the legal texts as she had been asked, though it was clear to both of them that this was a pretext. She worked in the library, while Julian attended to estate business in the adjoining study. Sometimes she asked Mrs. Dalton about the history of the house, and the housekeeper, pleased to have someone to talk to, would tell stories of past dukes and duchesses, of balls and scandals and winters, so harsh the river froze solid. Catherine listened with genuine interest, and Julian, overhearing from the next room, found himself listening too. Once she encountered him in the chapel. It was a small stone building at the edge of the estate, cold and spare, with narrow windows that let in pale light. Julian came there most mornings to pray, though his prayers were silent. Catherine had come to see the stained glass, a medieval piece depicting the Annunciation. She stood before it, her head tilted, studying the angel's outstretched hand. Julian entered and stopped when he saw her. She turned, met his gaze, and nodded in greeting. She did not speak. She did not intrude. She simply returned her attention to the glass. And after a moment, Julian knelt in the front pew and bowed his head. They remained there together, in silence, for perhaps 10 minutes. And when Catherine finally left, she did so without a word, her footsteps soft on the stone floor. But Julian felt her absence. The Dowager Duchess watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. She saw the way her nephew's gaze followed Catherine when she crossed the hall. She saw the way he positioned himself, unconsciously, so that he could see the library door when she entered. She saw the way his shoulders, so often rigid with the weight of his own discipline, began to ease. "She is good for him," Mrs. Dalton remarked one afternoon as they took tea in the Dowager's sitting room. "She is," the Dowager agreed, "but not because she coddles him, because she challenges him. Do you think he will speak again?" The Dowager set down her cup with care. "I think he will speak when he is ready to be wrong." It was late March when the solicitor arrived. His name was Mr. Greaves, a thin man with spectacles and a leather case full of documents. He had come to finalize the last details of the estate settlement related to the inquest. The tenants had been compensated. The disputed land had been reassigned. All that remained were signatures and seals. Catherine was in the library when Greaves and Pembroke met in the study. The door between the two rooms was ajar, and though she did not mean to eavesdrop, she could not help but hear. "A fine resolution, all told," Greaves was saying. His Grace's testimony, though written, was exemplary. The magistrate praised it in his final report. Of course, the matter was closed last autumn. No appeals, no further disputes. All settled. Catherine's hands stilled on the book she had been holding. Last autumn, 6 months ago, the inquest had been closed for half a year. The legal reason for Julian's silence had ended, and yet he had not spoken. She set the book down carefully. Her heart was beating faster, though she kept her expression calm. She rose and left the library, walking slowly through the corridors until she reached the gardens. The air was cold, but the first green shoots were beginning to push through the soil. She stood there for a long time, thinking. That night, when she entered the library, Julian was already there. He looked up as she came in, and for the first time, she thought she saw something in his eyes that might have been anticipation. She sat. She did not open her satchel. She looked at him directly. "There was once a man," she began, her voice quiet but firm, "who built a wall around his village to protect it from invaders. The wall was high and strong. It kept the people safe. And when the danger passed, when the invaders were defeated and peace returned to the land, the man refused to tear down the wall. He said it was a symbol of their vigilance, a reminder of what they had endured. But the wall cast a shadow over the village. It blocked the light. It kept the people inside from seeing the world beyond. And slowly, the wall became not a protection, but a prison." She paused. The fire crackled. The people begged him to take it down, but he would not, because to do so would be to admit that the wall, which had once been necessary, was no longer needed. And if it was no longer needed, then what had been the point of building it at all? What had been the point of the sacrifice, the labor, the years spent in shadow? Catherine did not look away from Julian's face. His jaw was tight. His hands gripped the arms of his chair. "The man died," she said softly, still believing he was protecting them. "And the people who had loved him tore down the wall the day after he was buried, not because they were ungrateful, but because they wanted to see the sky." She rose. She did not bid him good night. She simply left. Julian sat in the silence she had left behind. His chest felt tight. His throat ached with words he had not spoken in 2 years. He stared into the fire until it burned low, and then he went to his chambers and did not sleep. 3 nights later, Catherine came to the library as always. Julian was waiting. She entered, crossed the room, and took her seat. But she did not speak. She simply sat, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze resting somewhere in the middle distance. The fire burned, the clock ticked, and the silence stretched. Julian shifted in his chair. He glanced at her. She did not look at him. She did not explain. She did not begin a story. She simply remained, present but silent, and the absence of her voice was louder than any words she had ever spoken. He waited. She did not speak. He leaned forward slightly, as if to prompt her. She did not respond. The silence became unbearable. It pressed against him, heavy and cold, and for the first time in 2 years, Julian understood what his silence must have felt like to those around him. Not noble, not principled, just empty. Catherine rose. She smoothed her skirts. She looked at him, her gray eyes calm and sad and unflinching. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, and left. Julian sat alone in the library, surrounded by thousands of words written by other men, and felt the weight of his own voicelessness like a stone in his chest. He did not sleep that night. He paced his chambers. He knelt by his bed and tried to pray, but the words would not come, not even in his mind. At some point before dawn, he rose, dressed, and walked through the silent house to the chapel. The air inside was cold and still. The stained glass was dark, the angel's face hidden in shadow. Julian stood in the center of the stone floor, his breath misting, his hands clenched at his sides. And then he heard footsteps. Catherine entered through the side door. She wore a shawl over her nightdress, her hair loose around her shoulders. She stopped when she saw him, surprise flickering across her face. But she did not leave. She walked slowly down the aisle and stopped a few feet away. They stood in the dim light, facing each other. Julian's throat was tight. His heart was pounding. He had not spoken in 2 years. He had built his silence into a monument, a proof of his own righteousness. But it was no longer righteous. It was only fear. Fear that if he spoke now, after so long, it would unmake everything he had tried to be. Catherine waited. She did not prompt him. She did not plead. She simply stood there, patient and present, and gave him the space to choose. Julian drew in a breath. It shook in his chest, and then quietly, hoarsely, he spoke. "I was wrong." His voice was rough from disuse, barely more than a whisper, but it was a voice, his voice. Catherine's eyes widened, her lips parted, but she did not speak. Julian took a step closer. His hands trembled. "Not in my silence," he continued, each word deliberate and painful, but in keeping it, when it was no longer needed. Catherine's breath caught. Tears welled in her eyes, though she did not let them fall. Julian lifted his hands and framed her face gently, his palms warm against her cold skin. "Thank you," he said, his voice steadier now, "for every story, for every night, for not letting me hide." And then he kissed her. It was not desperate. It was not hurried. It was a kiss of equals, of recognition, of two people who had found each other in silence and chosen to speak. Catherine's hands came up to rest against his chest, and she kissed him back, her tears finally spilling over. When they pulled apart, the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the stained glass. The angel's face emerged from shadow, her hand outstretched in blessing. Julian rested his forehead against Catherine's. "Will you stay?" he asked, his voice low and rough and real. Catherine smiled, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." Spring came to Ashford Hall like a slow exhale. The frost melted. The gardens bloomed. The windows were opened, and the scent of earth and new growth filled the rooms. And Julian Ashford, Duke of Ashford, began to speak again, not all at once, not in grand declarations, but in small, deliberate moments. He greeted the servants by name. He spoke to his steward during morning meetings, his voice quiet but steady. He thanked Mrs. Dalton for her years of patience. He told his aunt, with genuine warmth, that he loved her. The household exhaled. The tension that had gripped Ashford Hall for 2 years eased, and laughter returned to the corridors. Catherine remained, not as a guest, but as something more. The Dowager Duchess, with her usual efficiency, made arrangements. A betrothal was announced. The village buzzed with gossip and approval. And Catherine, who had spent so many years invisible and unheard, found herself welcomed into a family that valued her not for her silence, but for her voice. In late April, Julian addressed the gathered tenants and local gentry in the great hall. It was his first public appearance since the inquest, and the room was packed. Catherine stood at the back, her hands folded, her heart steady. Julian stood at the front, his hands resting on the polished wood of the lectern. He looked out over the crowd, and then he spoke. "I have been silent for 2 years," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "I believed that silence was the only way to ensure that justice was not corrupted by my power. I believed that my voice, because of my title, could not be trusted, and so I removed it." He paused. The room was utterly still. "But I was wrong," he continued, "not in my intention, but in my execution. Because justice is not only about fairness. It is also about mercy, and mercy must be spoken. It must be heard. I denied that to those I sought to serve, And for that, I ask your forgiveness." There was a long silence. And then from the back of the room, an old tenant named Thomas stood. "You've nothing to apologize for, Your Grace," he said gruffly. "You did right by us, and you're doing right by us now." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Julian's shoulders eased. He nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," he said simply. After the gathering, Julian found Catherine in the library. She was standing by the window, looking out over the gardens where the first roses were beginning to bloom. He came to stand beside her. "I spoke today," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, her voice warm. "I heard you. It felt strange and right." She turned to look at him, her gray eyes bright. "Will you keep speaking?" "Every day," he said. "For as long as I live." Catherine smiled. "Good, because I have more stories to tell you. And this time I expect you to answer." Julian laughed, a sound so rare and unexpected that it startled them both. And then he took her hand, laced his fingers through hers, and led her to the chairs by the fire. "Tell me a story," he said, settling into his seat. Catherine sat across from him, as she had so many nights before. But this time, when she began to speak, Julian responded. Not to correct, not to challenge, but to continue. Their voices wove together, question and answer, story and response. Two people learning the shape of a shared language. Outside, spring unfolded across the estate. The trees leafed out. The fields turned green. The river ran high with snowmelt. And inside Ashford Hall, in the library where silence had once reigned, the sound of two voices filled the room. Julian Ashford had not spoken for 2 years, but Catherine Hale had told him a story every night. And in the end, his voice had come back, not because she had fixed him, but because she had shown him that silence, no matter how noble, could never be a substitute for the courage to speak. And every evening, when the lamps were lit and the house settled into its quiet rhythms, they sat together by the fire. Catherine would begin a story, and Julian would listen. And then, when she paused, he would speak, not because he had to, but because he chose to. Because love, in the end, is not about silence or speech. It is about the choice to be known. And Julian Ashford, after 2 years of hiding behind principle, had finally chosen to be seen. The house no longer held its breath. And in the library, where shadows and firelight danced across the walls, two voices spoke as one.